Okay. Hello. Oh, hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get our recording started. I have a couple of announcements and just kind of general thoughts before we get going with Photoshop, but today's going to be pretty much all about the Photoshop. Do I have any questions from you? Anybody have any immediate burning questions? No? All right, that's okay. So a couple of quick announcements. One announcement would be that I rearranged the tutorials a little bit. We had 2 pages of tutorials for collaging strategies and intermediate Photoshop tutorials, so I just combined them into 1 page to make that a little bit clearer and more efficient. So if you were looking for that page and wondering where it went, it got combined into the other page. So all the content is still there. The other thing that I've done, just based on some popular requests, is that I went ahead and I uploaded all of the example files that I might use for this demo and the last week's demo. They're sort of related. So basically, if you wanted to download any of these files to try using the techniques on your own computer, you could certainly do that. It's totally not required. That was just based on a couple of students that asked me. So today, we're going to be talking mostly, we're going to be taking this kind of mess that we made in the last lecture. And by mess, I mean just a random stack of kind of images that we worked on. And we're going to be hoping, you can't guarantee that you'll always make art. It's not a guarantee, but I'm pretty sure that we're going to go from this to something much more polished looking and much more sort of organized and composed. So that's basically my goal for the day. If we look at the week, on Wednesday, I'm going to be showing you some Photoshop techniques that are more relevant to individual image editing rather than collaging a bunch of stuff together in one sort of composition. So we're going to be looking more strictly at photographs and how to do kind of photography type things with photographs, digital photographs, of course. Does anybody have any kind of questions about any of that stuff or why we're here? So I have 2 happy things today. One is that I wore my spring scarf. And the main reason I decided to wear this today is because I enjoy lying to myself about when spring will arrive. The hoping and the dreaming begins now. So yeah, if I haven't already mentioned this, I'm from South Florida, so prepare, get ready for March and April. There's going to be a whole lot of complaining about the weather. I try to keep it to a minimum, but it's hard. If you're from a tropical climate, just doesn't get any easier every year. So let's jump into Photoshop and let's kind of use some of these files that we've been working with. So, I think I emailed you about this also. I got actually, just one quick thing before I jump into Photoshop. And one of those things is somebody asked me after our lecture last week about standing office hours. And I'm certainly not opposed to the idea of standing office hours. And if you all are feeling more confident actually using and possibly saying hello to me during those standing office hours, I will absolutely do that. So I guess what I think I've asked my colleagues about this just around the university, and they said that it works better if they email you even during the day when they're going to be at their office. So I would say in general, a good time for me to just do walk-in hours, if you're interested in that, would be after class, Mondays and Wednesdays from 4:15 to 5 o'clock. I can set aside that time for you to do walk-in visits with me in person. I'm like, oh my God. So yeah, I'll put that on the calendar at some point and maybe send you all out an email. But definitely, if you wanted to look for me in person, I'll be up in the Humanities building in the 6th floor. And my sort of studio number, I'll put this, I'm sure I'll send out an email to you all, but my studio number is 6331 in Humanities, and that's usually where I am. You might have to actually look for me for a tiny bit because I have a class that ends at 4:15, so I'll be in the process of coming back to my office after that class. But yeah, I would love to see you guys. That would be amazing. It would make me feel like a tiny bit like the world was not in the process of actively exploding constantly. So yeah, now with those if I incorporate some standing office hours into my schedule, which I think I totally can, I would absolutely still be available for as-needed visits on Zoom or whatever. I mean, in general, like if you want to meet with me, I can find a time for you. So yeah. All right, well, let's jump in here then. So as I left off in Photoshop, what we had been sort of engaged in this activity of taking these individual images, sort of looking at them individually. We would use various selection methods to make a layer mask. And one thing that I try to do every time I do a demo is I try to review some things from the last demo because if you have a brain that behaves like a goldfish, I totally understand and empathize with you. It helps me a lot personally, like if people go over stuff multiple times. So one thing that we're going to be going over today is this sort of basic process of selecting something from its background and making a layer mask. And then after doing that, we'll kind of move on to the newer stuff. But we used just to recap, we used a couple of different methods of bringing things in from other files. So one thing we did was we just selected the whole file, like here, and we did a sort of cut and paste using the keyboard. That is a completely valid approach if all you want to bring in is the entire image. If you want to bring in the image with a mask or with other kind of Photoshop-y stuff, if you cut and paste it, it won't necessarily retain all the Photoshop-y stuff. So the technique that we use for kind of retaining the Photoshop-iness, which in this case would be a layer mask, you can kind of just drag this thing up here and then drop it. And when you do that, when you use that method, it basically brings along any Photoshop stuff that might be attached to that, like type or a layer mask or an adjustment layer, or many other things. So did anybody have any kind of questions about that process in particular? Okay, so now let's just talk about one more thing, and that's we'll review making a layer mask. And so I'm going to use this image, which is a little bit different than the other images we've looked at. It's different in a couple of ways. First of all, it's a lot larger. It has a much larger pixel value. So I went ahead and just dragged it into the sort of collage file. I could also certainly open it up on its own, which I think actually would be a better kind of way of doing it. So I'm going to right-click and or double tap if you're on a multi-touch. I'm going to do Open With, Open Photoshop. Side note, if you are using your computer and there are certain like kind of fundamental things I'm doing, like with the operating system or how I just did Open With and it had the list of applications, if Photoshop for some reason is not in your list of applications, like send me an email and I'll help you set it up, because sometimes that is just a couple clicks. So if you have questions like that, definitely feel free to ask those over email. So I have this image. It's really large. This is like from a digital library project, so it's almost like 4,200 by 5,900 pixels. So it's big enough, actually, that I could probably print it at poster size, and it would still look really nice. So that's great. More pixels are generally better. So the first thing I need to do, I'm going to show you a couple of different techniques for making layer masks, because we still have a few of those to kind of chunk through. So the simplest way to make a layer mask is just to make a selection. And we sort of skipped ahead a tiny bit, and we used some of the more complicated selection methods, like the magic wand tool or the object selection tool in our last talk. There's a much easier way to make a selection, and that is to use the various marquee tools. And then there are other selection tools as well, like the Polygonal Lasso tool that I'm a huge fan of. So these marquee tools are awesome if you just want to take a chunk of an image, like that, for example, and you can either turn that into a crop, you can now make a layer mask around everything else. And so they're more sort of like, it's a little less like, using tweezers to take care of your eyebrows, which maybe the Magic Wand tool is like that kind of tweezer tool. This is more like taking a bunch of clippers and just being like, not that you would ever do that. But yeah, these tools are sort of like more powerful, but they're less sort of nuanced, right? So you can't get as much sort of interesting sort of detail with them. But they all pretty much work the same, which is just click and drag. The elliptical marquee tool and the rectangular marquee tool, if you hit the shift key, that will make them square or circular variously. But in this case, we're using the rectangular marquee tool, and it looks like our selection is pretty clear in this case. It's this leaf, right? So if I wanted to start here and actually make a layer mask, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. So I can go in here, make a layer mask. I want to reveal the selection. And you can see that by doing that, I basically set myself up. I still have this layer mask here. I sort of set myself up to make my next steps a little easier. Because I don't have to deal with like all of the image boundary anymore when I'm magic wanding. So here, I could go ahead and use the Magic Wand tool, and that's taking care of a lot again. And so at this point, I have the layer mask selected. I could do one of two things. I could just hit the delete key. Now, importantly, I'm actually deleting those pixels from the layer mask. If I have the object selected and I hit the delete key, you can see the layer mask is still the same, right? So that means that I literally just deleted those pixels, and unless I use the history palette, they're not coming back. So that's something to think about. So in general, and this is like really well documented in a lot of different places, the reason that we use layer masks is because layer masks are a method of non-destructive editing. And so what that means is that if I take this layer mask and let's say disable it, oh, hey, check it out. My entire file is still there, right? And I can kind of work on it infinitely. So that's why they call it non-destructive editing, because you're basically sort of applying something that you can disable or delete, and then still have all your pixels there. So I'm going to go ahead and enable the layer mask because it was going so well. And now you can see I'm mostly done if what I'm trying to do is kind of isolate this leaf. But there's a couple more things I can do. One thing I can do is get rid of this big chunk over here. So this is like crying for the Polygonal Lasso tool. The Polygonal Lasso tool is literally one of the very first tools that was developed in Photoshop. And if you're ever like looking for somebody who's been using Photoshop like since they were in elementary school in the mid-'80s, you have officially met that person. But yeah, the Polygonal Lasso tool is like super simple but super powerful because you can just super quickly like draw around chunks and get rid of them. So the Polygonal Lasso tool is like one of these tools that's maybe like slightly forgotten, but it's many people, it's kind of their favorite tool in Photoshop. So we're still not kind of all the way there with this layer mask. There's a couple of other things that we could do. One thing we could do is to get rid of all this white stuff. And I want to show you another method of masking in Photoshop in order to get us there. Actually, I'm going to save it for later. I'm not 100% sure that this would be the best way to do it. So I'm going to Magic Wand tool just one section of this stuff. And as promised, right now we have a couple of boxes checked. So we have the box that says contiguous checked, which we know that there's a workaround for this. Like if I want to select the non-contiguous areas, as in the white areas that are not touching this white area, we can go in and use the similar. That's like a really easy way to kind of get all that stuff into the selection. If you go ahead and deselect the contiguous box and just make a selection, it will also have sort of the same characteristics. This would actually be a really great opportunity to talk about tolerance. And so right now you can see that when we selected this white stuff, that it is interpreting what it considers white. It's like a problem with whiteness in general, right? Like, but in this case, we're actually talking about this, which it's kind of going too far, right? It's painting with a brush that is somewhat too aggressive. And so in this case, like, how would we sort of get the point through to Photoshop that this is not sort of the whiteness that we're looking for? Probably by lowering the tolerance. So when you lower the tolerance, it lowers the number of pixels that get selected overall. So you can see it didn't eat in as much when we lowered the tolerance. We cut the tolerance in half. I would probably do that again and maybe just go a little bit lower. We might even go all the way down to like 5. 5 is kind of a good level for me. And so at this point, this is looking pretty okay. Now, I hear what you're saying. You might be like, oh, look at all those little sparkly things. Yeah, we can take care of that. And that's the kind of thing where maybe we don't want to take care of it with the magic wand tool. We might want to actually take care of that with some other means. So probably I would try both of these functions, going to grow and similar. Both of these functions are a little bit hard to control. So here, similar definitely took care of quite a bit of it. And then the other way that we could go in and kind of get some of these little flurries, is what I sometimes call them. They're basically just dust and scratches or, impurities in the sort of background that were there. One of the best ways to kind of get at them is by doing it the digital equivalent of by hand. So I went ahead and activated what's called quick mask mode in here. It's down there, so we have been editing in standard mode, which is this. And when you go to quick mask mode, it gives you like a visual preview of what's selected and what's not selected with red. And so from here, you might want to do this on one or two of your images, but certainly not all, because it would take forever. From here, you can go in with a brush or an eraser and just delete directly from the mask. Or in this case, it's a selection, pardon me. So time-consuming, yes. Excellent results, yes. Other ways to do it? Yeah, probably, but this is definitely the best way to do it if you want to control it yourself. And now you may say, okay, well, that's kind of like tedious, Meg. I don't have the bandwidth for that. And I would say, all right, fine. Well, check this out. You can even just use like a Polygonal Lasso tool and grab multiple icks at the same time. And then use you have to finish the selection by clicking on that 0, and then just get rid of them kind of en masse. So there are ways to kind of like eliminate some of the handwork in Quick Mask. But basically, if you're doing a mask where it's like incredibly detailed and some of the automated selection tools are not working for you, I would recommend using Quick Mask. End of story. Quick Mask is awesome. So if we take this out of Quick Mask now, we're still sort of back in this zone where we have this really complex selection. And I was just going to hit the delete key, but that would be so not... Does anyone want to tell me why I might not want to hit the delete key right this second? Because I didn't click on the layer mask. Right. So yeah, if I click on the layer mask and then hit the delete key, now you can see like we're approaching some sort of, and then deselect, and we are now kind of approaching something that looks pretty dece. Could it always look more dece? Yes, that's one of the awesome things about the layer mask, is that you can work on it literally forever. If you're one of those people that kind of has problems like putting stuff down, like if you like to work on things or do do projects and then like you can't finish them, I don't recommend digital media art. Because yeah, I just like sometimes we'll work on projects for years. Gets a little ridiculous. So anyway, I'm just going to take this layer and bump it on top of my other layers here. And so now I want to show you one other method for selecting things from their background. And then what we're going to do is we're going to kind of come in here and we're going to talk about layer blending, layer stacking, and layer grouping. And basically, like, we're going to try to take this mess that we've created by dumping a bunch of images on a canvas, and we're going to try to like organize it and turn it into something. So you might be asking, do I always like begin art projects by making a huge mess? Yes. That's very much part of the artistic process. So I think this image would be, this other fern image would be nice. Oh, I keep dragging it when I want to do this. Okay, so this looks like deceivingly easy maybe, because through here I could definitely see getting really great results with the Magic Wand tool because there's a really clear delineation between the object and the background. That starts to kind of break down a little bit in this part. So what I'm guessing for this is that we'll have to basically do a little bit of Magic Wand work, a little bit of quick mask work, and then we'll get it out. I think also, you know, one of the key sort of creative decisions that you're making when you do this process is you're trying to remove the quote-unquote object from the background, but in a way, you know, it also doesn't hurt to sort of ask yourself, like, what object you're actually interested in. Like, are we interested in this entire fern leaf, or are we maybe only interested in, like, a couple of these? And so maybe I'll kind of do that, where I just go for a couple of these, just to kind of show you a little bit better how you would do something that's not so straightforward. So in this case, I would definitely start with a polygonal lasso tool, just for kind of my own sanity. So basically, like, what I do is I take the polygonal lasso tool and just draw like a big, messy box around the object. And then when you get this little 0, you know, you can close it. And then add that to my layer mask. So I am revealing the selection. And that just kind of like gives me like a little bit of a head start on working on this thing. And I think I'm going to go for this green. It's definitely much easier to sort of select the green, in this particular green in this case, because it's there's a huge amount of tonal variation in the green in the background, right? So in this case, you might be asking yourself, it seems to be kind of tentative in its selection. Well, that's because I had the tolerance turned way down from before. So I'm going to go for like a maybe 25 on the tolerance, which is like a medium high. And then I can hit the shift key and just start kind of bringing some of this stuff into our selection. Now, I've been using these Magic Wand tools, and I remember saying just a couple seconds ago, that I wanted to only select a couple of these. Well, it's sort of the same no matter what you do. So I'm going to go ahead and put these pixels in the layer mask. So up in the layer menu, just delete, excuse me. So in this case, because I selected the actual object, I have to invert the selection, which is something you'll see quite a bit. And now I can delete those pixels from the layer mask. So basically what I'm faced with now is just this sort of challenge of like cutting these out in a way that looks acceptable, right? So I could definitely come back to the polygonal lasso tool and kind of do the broad strokes with that. So I would also want to invert my selection in this case, because I want to take everything that's outside of that and throw it in the layer mask. So now I have myself like a much more approachable problem, right? Or a much easier to solve problem. This is definitely like a case where I probably will want to actually come in with some level of detail and go ahead and use some brushwork. Now, you might be asking me, Meg, why are you still using the Polygonal Lasso tool? And I will say, because it is easy, and I am lazy. And it's a lot easier to do this than it is to delete this stuff with a brush. Although, brush tools are amazing, brush tools are really for detail. So invert again, delete from the layer mask. And so now, at this point, this would be, in my opinion, a sane use of quick mask. And why do I say it's sane? Because if we were trying to kind of like do this entire image with a tiny brush in quick mask, that seems less than sane to me in terms of the workload. And yeah, so basically now I can come in with a brush, and when you use brushes in Photoshop, they are pretty fun. Up here is pretty much all the controls for the brush. So here, if I want, hopefully you have your Photoshop set up this way. This should be the default. If you don't see, like, can everyone see that round thing there? That's called the precise brush cursor, where it actually manages it mirrors the number of pixels that you've selected in the brush size. That should be the default. If your brush doesn't look that way, like, ask me or one of the TAs to set it back to the default settings, because it's super useful to have your brush be exactly the same size as the pixels, because then you can see, in this case, oh, this brush is maybe just the right size to take on this chunk right here. And I can do this pretty easily. Now, I do want to point out to everyone that I'm working on a trackpad right now. It's so hard. But if you have Photoshop on your iPad, this is like the perfect thing to do in Photoshop on your iPad or your tablet. Also, if you happen to have this exotic device known as a graphics tablet, which works outside of a tablet with a screen, this would also be an excellent time to go find your tablet. If you're interested in using graphics tablets or what that experience might be like, I would avail yourself of the various libraries. And nobody has asked this question yet, but this is an awesome question. Hey, Meg, do you care if I use Photoshop on my iPad? And I would say, absolutely not, although it would probably be a good idea to sort of do the final work, in the desktop app, just because that's sort of what we're doing. But basically, the answer is no, I do not. Photoshop is Photoshop, and which buttons you click or what interface you use doesn't have that much of an effect on your learning. Yes? How do I click on Quick Mask? Okay, so over here in my cursor, it's this button right here. It kind of toggles, yeah. Yeah, it's down there on the bottom. So it's basically the default location is the bottom of the large toolkit, pretty much in every configuration of Photoshop I've ever seen. And then also, yeah. Any other questions? All right, so I'm just going to finish off this little thing right here. Oh, just one other quick thing. When you're doing selections with Quick Mask, it's probably a good idea to have the hardness of the brush set all the way to 100. And I'll demonstrate why in just a second. Well, you can see here I didn't have the hardness set all the way to 100. And so it doesn't really matter in areas like this that are disconnected from your whatever you're going to have as your result. But here, where we start to kind of eat into whatever we wanted to mask, the quality of that edge really matters like a lot. And so you'll get a nicer looking edge if you use a hard brush, which is kind of counterintuitive. But basically what happens is by using a hard brush, you're leaving it to Photoshop to kind of like to what's called anti-alias these pixels, and it will look much better. Sometimes people think that if they are making selections that using a fuzzy brush is like the answer, and it can be for certain things, but in general, a fuzzy brush is going to just make your selection look sort of and it kind of blends into the background. Or the worst case scenario is you might have like a halo around your object. So for that reason, when you're doing sort of this type of work, I would use a hard brush. You might find yourself sort of wanting to have a blurrier edge, but you know what? You can do that by using the Modify Selection menu that we used last week. And when you do it with the Modify Selection menu, you can kind of dial it in just right and make it exactly what you want. So I'm not going to spend the entire class period, painting on Quick Mask, although I do love to paint on some Quick Mask. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to kind of get these little pieces out here. Whoops. Invert that selection. So I'll get these little pieces out, and we'll just go ahead and use this as is, I think. Let's see how much. Might hurt my soul a tiny bit. I think I'm just going to get rid of some of these dots and stuff. And don't forget, if we're quick masking, layer masking over here, there's no reason why we can't continue to refine the layer mask when it's in our collage. And that's one of the real kind of big benefits of using layer masks, is that they stay sort of open and flexible right to the end. So I'm not 100% sure that actually copied over. Okay, so you might get this warning, certainly from my demo sources. It's basically saying that it has a different color depth. I would say, yes, you do want to proceed. That's just what happens when you get images from a lot of different sources that you can't control. So yeah, I would get that in there. And so, yeah, so here's our little blips. And at this point, I feel like we need to kind of do some major organization and house cleaning. Who knew that the fun of art could be dominated by house cleaning? But it can. So I'm going to start by kind of turning off all my layers and looking at them one by one. So that's just a generally good thing to do. I've got these two things. I've got this thing and this thing. This thing, cats, more jellyfish, and more jellyfish. So the first thing that I would consider doing here is, one of the things that I'm sort of thinking about is that we have some images that are very rectangular and some images that are sort of taken out of that rectangular context, right? So I think it's almost guaranteed that the images that are not rectangular anymore are not going to be the background. And so I have those on the top of the stack anyway, so that's fine. One thing you might want to consider doing when you're doing this type of task is you can pop out the layers palette like so. And it basically just allows you to dominate with the layers palette a little bit more. And there are certain times when you're using Photoshop, you don't need to use the layers palette at all. This is a time where we're using the layers palette a lot, and we kind of need to see what's going on. So I like popping out windows when I'm in a period of using them a lot, just for ease of use. So I think that actually this one, even though it's already down here, might be a really great background. Now, we do have a background layer that Photoshop generates for us when we open up the composition. So that's kind of the default layer. You can hit this lock, and at that point, it becomes layer 0. Pretty much hitting that lock is like the first thing I do in almost any Photoshop file, because I almost never want to have the background be some nameless, faceless, white square. So it's just one of those things that you sort of get used to. In this case, I don't even think we really need layer 0, but I'm going to keep it around in case I want to have a solid fill back there. Here, you can see we have layer 1, and it looks like, sorry, I thought I saw a question. So it looks like layer 1 is a little bit like undersized. We've had this conversation before about pixels and scale. So I do think it would be helpful for this and almost any sort of like collage image to have one image or texture or whatever that basically fills up the screen. And in this case, it looks like this image is not quite large enough. So I think the question that we need to sort of ask ourselves is, what's our image size, which is 3300 by 2550 pixels? And do I have any images in this stack that would function really well as background images? So it looks like this image has enough resolution to actually just be added to the background. So I think I'm going to go ahead and just do that. And then we can use these smaller images for, sort of like floating images as part of the composition. So basically, I'm going to put the roof down on the bottom. I'm also going to take the roof, and I'm going to crop it, scale it so that it fills up the screen. So that's super straightforward. Any layer in Photoshop, you can come up here and hit Show Transform Controls, and then you can go ahead and scale it. Now, I'm not super concerned about scaling this because it was quite a bit more pixels than the size of the image, so I've got a lot of flexibility there. Okay, so there's a background image, and now we've got, I'm just going to bring these down together because they're the same image. It looks like this is a direct copy of the other one, so I'm going to delete this one by dragging it down to the trash. And then here, it looks like I've got 2 of these, too. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think this one is significantly masked out. So one of the things when you do these sort of processes, and this is just like talking more generally about the artistic process rather than kind of how Photoshop works, but you may have noticed that like I got myself a stack of images that I'm vaguely interested in, or that I think might be vaguely good for this project, right? I don't have to use them all. Like, there's no one standing behind me being like, use every single image in your folder. If it doesn't look right, don't use it. So, like, I'm basically going to kind of make that call as I'm making the work. These things fit together in an interesting way. These things don't fit together in a way that I find interesting or pleasing in some way. And who gets to make that decision? Me or you. 100% your decision. So yeah, I'm a little skeptical right now of this, just because I feel like it might not fit with the other images as well. This cat thing is super fun. I think I might actually take the cat stuff and think about like scaling it a bit. Again, the cat image, because I generated it, so I know exactly how many pixels it is, it's got enough sort of pixels to do that. These smaller images that I got from the internet are not sort of like going to give me that flexibility in scaling. Okay, so there's some cats, and then we still have more sort of stuff. That's interesting. Oh, interesting. Hang on just one second. Okay. So this Show Transform Controls box, like I know I had advised you to turn it on. it's not sort of like my preference to have it on all the time. I like to actually only use it when I'm actually trying to move things around, because it can kind of get in the way a little bit. So basically, I'm just kind of like moving stuff around on the screen and trying to create some like visual relationships. So like there's this idea here of these images being kind of like slightly eaten away at, and then having maybe the full sort of version here. Here's like a trick that I probably used Photoshop for like 15 years before I learned this trick, and then I was really mad at myself for not knowing it before, so I'm going to tell you what it is. That is that if you're in Photoshop and you have the Move tool selected, you can right-click on any area of the screen or double-tap if you're on, and it will show you every single layer that occupies that space where you clicked. What? I know. So you can like switch back and forth between layers by basically using that right-click tool. It's a total game changer. But anyway, you might enjoy that. So yeah, in this case, it's kind of hard to like think about this as like a visual composition without thinking about the rectangles. And there's probably some stuff that I could do to kind of like get rid of the rectangles. But at this point, basically, like, I'd love to like, walk you through every tiny little thing that I'm doing, but I don't necessarily feel like that would be that useful. The sort of short form is I'm moving stuff around until it looks right. And that's what, looks right to you, by the way, not looks right according to some objective standard that some dude made up. Yeah, that's basically what art making is. So, but some things that are good to sort of think about in a composition in general, I would definitely think about most compositions have a sort of weight towards the bottom. In other words, there's a visual weight that's toward the bottom. So you can definitely see that in this image. Like there's more going on in the bottom than there is going on in the top. And that's not necessarily like a commandment. That's more like, look at a landscape. Like, is there more going on the bottom than on the top in a landscape? Usually, right? It's just a visual convention, right? So by sort of some of these rules that we talk about or that the TAs might talk about, they're not rules. They're just expectations that people bring to images, right? So another thing is that, people expect images to be organized or unorganized. Right now, in this image, where it is right at this moment, it actually is organized. It's just not organized to like a great level, right? Like, but there is some organization that we can point to with the jellyfish or the cats, right? Another thing to sort of think about is like balance in color and tone. So one of the things that's really hard to navigate with Photoshop is that you can basically make anything out of anything. You can make it look like anything, any color. And so it has a tendency to produce images that are like, like screaming at you because they've got the full color rainbow, the full, range of shapes, the full range of everything. And so in general, like my suggestion is to start wide. So start with a big stack of images and then pare it down or edit down. If that doesn't work for you, talk to the TAs about another approach. But that's definitely the approach that we're kind of emphasizing in this class. And that idea of editing is really super, super important. So here, for example, if I thought about maybe ways to organize this image a little bit better, I would think about the fact that these jellyfish are creating like a really high contrast visual relationship, the blue and the orange, right? Those jellyfish are like the most dominant part of the composition right now. So if I wanted to think about maybe decreasing the importance of the jellyfish, I could just think about maybe changing the stacking a little bit. So it looks like I knocked them back a tiny bit by adding cats. Generally, adding cats is like my favorite solution for everything. But in all seriousness, there are other ways that we could potentially like make these jellyfish a tiny bit less present. And one, probably my favorite way, would be to use the various layer blending modes. So as you can see, like if we just choose a different layer blending mode, those jellyfish now have a radically different level of visual importance, right? So that's like one of your main tools for pushing things back. Another way to sort of think about it would be if I took the roof, this sort of background image, and just made it less contrasty. So I could make it less contrasty in various ways. Like, I mean, you can see it's like really contrasty, right? It's like got white and kind of dark gray black areas where it's got this geometric thing happening. That's like that's pretty dominant visually also. So one of the things that I could do to kind of tamp that back a tiny bit also would be to play around with the opacity. And you can see here, like even at 67%, if I put the white layer underneath it, it should look a little bit more present. Then you don't have to look at the checkerboard grid. But again, like radically different visual importance, right? So probably what I would consider doing here is maybe taking this one and also sort of like knocking that opacity back a little bit. And then also this one. So is it a perfect composition? Oh, definitely not. I'm just trying to show you some sort of strategies for like moving things back and forth in terms of pictorial emphasis, you know? My sort of big gripe with this as a composition right now is that this image here is just like way too strong, right? So could there be some interesting ways that I could probably work it in and make it less strong? Probably, yeah. I could certainly think about, you know, just having it in there and incorporating some color. So this is sort of getting to like a slightly better space. Also with this, could I add this in? Sure, I could add this in, but now it's bringing like a whole other language of color, right? Because we had been talking about like the blue and the orange as being like kind of a big deal and kind of very attention grabbing. Certainly the hot pink doesn't help, but there's only like a tiny touch of that. And so adding in green, again, is like, I don't know if I'd go for that. So maybe this one, actually, if we're going to add it in, we could add it in as a black and white image. And to do that, we can just select the luminosity layer. And then you even get some really great like color blending. So basically, like one of the things that I was hoping to show you today was kind of different ways of just dealing with layers and combining them and all that stuff. One other thing that I want to show you quickly is I'm going to take these 3 layers because they sort of work together. These are the jellyfish layers, basically. I'm going to take these and I'm going to make a group from layers. And groups from layers are really awesome. Like in this case, we have this image of cats, right? And the image of cats is like, obviously, like, hey, I'm cats. No one's more awesome than me. But really, what that image of cats is sort of telling us is that I'm a bunch of visual objects that have been crammed into a single image, right? And what happens when you start to sort of build out files in Photoshop is that you could theoretically, you know, if you were actually adding these cats individually in Photoshop, you could probably imagine what a nightmare that would be, right? And the way to kind of get around that nightmare is to make groups. And so when you make a layer group, you can basically do anything to that group that you would normally do to the layer. So in this case, if I select the group and then, excuse me? So this auto select thing is like driving me crazy. I got a new laptop a few months ago, and I think some of those defaults are still in place. But this is what the default that you are using should look like, which is basically that if you select on the group, you basically move the entire group. So in order to get it to work that way, if you have a fresh installation of Photoshop, you might want to make sure this box is unchecked. And yeah, I mean, groups are so awesome because you can basically do anything with a group that you would do with a layer. So I think we can stop there, and definitely we'll continue on Wednesday. today. We're going to switch gears a tiny bit and talk about really photo-based images and getting sort of photorealistic stuff.